George Samueli is a senior research fellow at Global Policy Institute, joins us from Budapest. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, journalist, and author, joins us from London. Welcome to you both. George Samueli, it couldn't be more blunt in terms of the rhetoric coming from Russia that points to perhaps a possible military confrontation. Do you think that's where this is headed?
Well, there's a distinct possibility. The United States and the leadership in Kiev have been playing a very dangerous game of continual escalation, and the US has been giving apparently unconditional support to the Kiev government. So in other words, it has essentially subscribed to the way that Kiev wants to present this conflict. And Kiev wants to present it as, oh, Ukraine is the victim of Russian aggression, and therefore we, the United States, NATO, everybody must stand with Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Well, of course, that isn't really what's happening. I mean, what's happening is that there is a conflict between the government of Kiev and the Donetsk and Lugansk republics. So given this unconditional support, then there could well be some reckless act on the part of Kiev that would lead to an offensive, and then there's a very good chance that Russia would intervene. So it's a very dangerous game. Whereas, a responsible leadership in Washington would say there needs to be a de-escalation, and there needs to be a return to negotiation on the basis of the Minsk Accords. And the Minsk Accords, of course, entail negotiations between Kiev and the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk. But Ukraine doesn't want to do that. Instead, Ukraine wants to play this game. Oh, we are the victims of Russian aggression. Please help us against Russia. That is a very dangerous game.
Marcus Papadopoulos, is Ukraine a victim of Russian aggression?
Ukraine is most certainly not a victim of Russian aggression. Ukraine is a victim of America's incessant and insatiable lust for ever more power and influence in the world. Indeed, America's ever incessant and insatiable lust for preserving its global hegemony is to the detriment of the national security of not just Russia in the world, but many other countries, for example, Syria and Iran. And the Americans have been lusting after Ukraine ever since it became independent in December of 1991. But as a result of the American, British and European orchestrated coup in Kiev in February of 2014 against a democratically elected president, the Americans now see within their grasp their complete objective of bringing Ukraine into the ranks of NATO. And by bringing Ukraine into the ranks of NATO, Russia would be totally encircled on its western borders by NATO member states. And the Americans are not just introducing, though covertly, introducing NATO forces onto Ukrainian territory. The Americans are also making the Black Sea region an extremely volatile one. How? Because the Americans are upgrading the Ukrainian ports of Odessa, Nikolaev, and Okhotsk in order to accommodate American warships. Now, Russia cannot allow America to flex its muscles in such an aggressive way towards Russia. Why? Because that seriously jeopardizes Russian national security. The Americans would never tolerate Russia in its backyard. So why should Russia tolerate the Americans in its backyard? And in regard to the tension we've seen over the last few days, well, perhaps it's a matter of a war of nerves. The Ukrainian military has started deploying quite significant numbers of its forces, troops and equipment to the Donbass, including heavy artillery. And in response, the Russians are deploying its forces to the border with Ukraine. That could be a war of nerves. I do not believe, given the present, in light of what we see at present, that there will be a war. But nonetheless, it is a very dangerous situation. And the Americans, and of course the British, though not the Germans or the French, are encouraging the Ukrainians to try and provoke the Russians in order to justify their argument that Russia is a threat to Ukraine and Ukraine needs to be brought into the ranks of NATO. But let me say this as well. There is no war, there is no tension between the Ukrainian people and the Russian people. The Ukrainian people, by and large, see the Russian people as their brothers, as their sisters, as a fraternal people. There is only a problem between the Ukrainian government and Russia. And indeed, the Ukrainian government have absolute contempt for vast swathes of its own population. People, millions of Ukrainians from Odessa to Dnipropetrovsk to Kharkov do not wish to be in NATO, and they see Russia as the mother country. And yet the Ukrainian government not just dismiss the views of those Ukrainians, but they have absolute contempt, and they are endangering the lives of those people in Ukraine.
Well, George Samielli, what do you make of the trip of the U.S. Secretary of State? The Defense Minister, the U.S. Defense Minister, going to NATO, and I'm looking at the latest coming out of that meeting. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister saying at NATO, saying sanctions on Russia and more military support could help Ukraine. Of course, the U.S. has given Ukraine its, I believe, 100% support, whether it's militarily or otherwise. And I think Turkey is now in the mix also. So what do you make of that?
Well, that's the game that Ukraine has been playing. Ukraine has pretended to go along with the Minsk Accords for one reason only, and that was to ensure that the Europeans and the Americans can be persuaded to impose further and further sanctions against Russia by saying, oh, look, Russia isn't adhering to the Minsk Accords. Well, of course, Russia is not actually a party to the Minsk Accords. I mean, the Minsk Accords are between Ukraine and the peoples of the Donetsk and Lugansk. Russia, like France and like Germany, is one of the guarantors of the agreement. But Ukraine pretends to go along with the Minsk Accord, but it hasn't done anything to comply with it. One of the key elements of the Minsk Accords was autonomy and a special status for the people of the Donbass. Ukraine hasn't even remotely come to achieving that. But they want to maintain this fiction that, oh, we're still part of the Accords in order to press the Americans and the Europeans to keep imposing sanctions on Russia and to raise the alarm that Ukraine's in danger, Ukraine's about to be invaded, and the only way we can prevent an invasion of Russia is for Ukraine to be co-opted into NATO. So again, it's a foolish and dangerous game that Ukraine is playing.
Okay, we're going to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you very much for that. That's George Samielli, Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute, and Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you, historian, journalist, and author. And that brings us to an end of this news review.